Good evening, my people. I hope you and your families are doing well. To those who are watching live, I'm going to be on TikTok. To those who are going to be watching later, I want to thank you for tuning in. One second, some technical hitches. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to our AEA Films YouTube channel, where our focus, as you know, is telling African stories to the mainstream. Now, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We have a playlist of documentaries shot across Africa, from Voodoo in Togo, the Dahomey Kingdom, Mali, and most recently our 4-part documentary series, Kemet, A Journey Through the Black Land. In that documentary, I explore the Nile Valley, particularly the Nile River, as I travel from Cairo way down to Abu Simbel and back up north to Alexandria, discussing the African origin of Egyptian culture. So as we say where I come from, no. Okay, so you're welcome to this live, guys. Thank you. Tonight we'll be discussing, or actually we'll be picking up from our last discussion, which is on how Nigeria was formed from 1860 to 1960. And we're going to move that forward to discuss the Biafran War. But first, the things which led up to it. And we won't go up to the Biafra War. We'll stop just at the first coup of January 1966. So questions I really want to be asking is, why did it happen? Was it an Igbo coup? And of course, who the main people were that were involved. Thank you very much for tuning in, guys. I'm trying out some new stuff on this thing, so I don't know how well it's working out. So give me a 1, first of all, those who are here. Give me a 1 if you can hear me. Let me make sure that you can. Festus, my bad. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to go live on TikTok as well. So I've been planning this. For those of you who don't know, last week was my father's funeral, which is why I didn't do the live. We've buried my father successfully, I thank God, and now it's just a question of keeping his legacy going. You know, my father was a very important man to me. He was a very important man to Nigeria, and a lot of what I have in terms of my love for history, my love for our culture, and also the depths of research comes from my father. So he's a huge role model of mine. And you know, Dr. Campbell said to me when my father died, he said, because his father died earlier on in the year as well, he said that when your father dies, you become more free. So let's see. Anyway, let's get started. I don't want to keep you guys too long. There's a lot we're going to be discussing today. Let me give that to you in a big screen so that you could see that. So why the Biafra War happened. And then, of course, those of you who don't have us on our TikTok, make sure you join in. Thank you very much to Festus Osifeso. Thank you very much, my brother. I appreciate it. Thank you. Very grateful that you guys could tune in. So let's get started. I don't want to waste your time. I've prepared my notes, but before anything, I want to make sure you guys, those of you on YouTube, can see these books. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about has come from research from these particular books. So Ironsi, Nigeria, the Army, Power and Politics. Olusegun Obasanjo's book, My Command. I'm going to reference it a few more times today. For those of you who don't know, he also wrote another book called Nzogu, because him and Nzogu is involved in the first coup. Him and Nzogu were quite close friends, so he wrote a biography of him, which, not a biography, but more of like a memoir of their relationship. So he even chronicles some of his documents that he sent him, some of his letters that he sent him. The Fall of Biafra by Ben Boulier, Nigeria's Five Majors, also by Ben Boulier, and The Tragedy of Victory, very good book. Why We Struck, also by Why We Struck is by Adewale Ademoyega. Let me take off this little thing. 1 second, guys. I'm trying out some new stuff, so I don't know how well it's looking. Give me a 1 if you're enjoying what you see. Anyway, to those people on TikTok, it's probably easier to come on YouTube, AEA Films UK. All right, so let's get started. So I have some notes that I've got prepared, so I'm going to be referring to them as we go through. Now, before we begin, I want to state categorically from the evidence that Biafra was never an idea until the summer of 1966. If you look at the evidence, Biafra was not an idea until the summer of 1966, and that's very important. And as I said from the last session, the Igbos and the Easterners generally chose to forego the advancement of the so-called Eastern region, whatever you want to call it, or what eventually became Biafra land. They chose to forego this in favor of the larger region of Nigeria. And they were not concerned with a small, if you want to call it an enclave of the country, and had already established themselves in the civil service. They established themselves in the Army Officer Corps, in politics, and in business. And I'm going to be discussing the different realms, the different key players that were involved in those different fields. Tonight, I want to mainly present to you the evidence from a series of books, which I've mentioned, by the key actors of the people who knew them best, okay? Bear with me. Let me just split my screen so you guys can see me. Okay. Okay. So if you haven't seen the previous session, How Nigeria Was Formed 1860 to 1960, be sure to watch it after this one. I'm going to also link it in the description so you guys will be able to see it immediately after this, if you haven't already. And I urge you people, I urge you to stay focused and watch this video until the end. And as I always say, please don't take my word for it. Double check the points that I'm making. And whatever your opinions, make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button, okay? This is going to be a long one, so I'll read your comments at the very end, but thank you very much for the super chats already. So again, those books are very important books. Why We Struck Nzogu, Nigeria's Five Majors, The Fall of Biafra, Ironsi, Nigeria, the Army, Power and Politics, My Command, Tragedy of Victory, and Samuel Ladoke Akintola, In the Eyes of History. Okay, so that's a biography. Now, post-war recap. So 1945 to 1960. So after the Second World War, if you remember from the last session, we discussed that the years following the Second World War were an important time in the nationalists/independence struggle across what they called the global South. So I'm talking Africa, I'm talking Asia. Independence started to be discussed. And this was the same in Nigeria. Now, at the time, independence meant freedom. And as Ojukwu once said, it would have meant us joining a higher league of nations. It shouldn't have been seen as the beginning of something. And so many, such as Herbert Macaulay, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Awolowo, and others, began pursuing this in the South, whilst the North worked with the British to get themselves ready for it. So the idea was to form a nation through the Macpherson Act. If you remember, we discussed that towards the end of the last session, bringing the various regions under one federation, North, West, and East. Now, in reality, Nigeria has never been a nation because the powers were concentrated on the North due to its so-called geographical size and its supposed population. So these teething problems manifested themselves in many ways. The size of the North, for example, the religion aspect, corruption, bad administration. The real problem came from the West, which began to show some chaos before independence. And it was in total turmoil by 1966, which we'll come to at some point. Now, the West probably the West problem really lay in its geographical location as the heart of the colony in Lagos. So they had to figure out where their own regional leader would lead from, you see? Because in the North, the Sardana of Sokoto, who was Ahmadu Bello, he led from Kaduna and had an agent in the South in the form of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, who would later become the prime minister. Awolowo from the West believed his position would have had a greater effect on Nigeria if he ruled from the Federation. And so he looked towards Lagos. Now, his agent, Akintola, who would eventually turn out to be somewhat of a snake, was initially in agreement through their Action Group Party. He eventually defected and supported the North. Now, during the general election, Azikiwe, under the NCNC, even won an election in the West, which made it look like an Igbo man was ruling both East and West. So the roots of the problem that faced those first elections of 1959 and then the First Republic lay in the so-called Western problem. I prefer to look at this more like I prefer to look at this more as a Western problem than to say Yoruba. I know a lot of people want to jump on that and just say, "Oh, Yoruba people." I don't think it's that. It's more of the geopolitics that was at play, less the kind of tribalism thing. And I want to use this session to try and break down some of the background of what led to the Civil War. We won't get to the full Civil War today. It's just too much to do. And I want to use this evidence. I want to use the evidence available to all of us to dispel some of the rumors and myths about the war and see what lessons that can be learned. So let's move on to the very, very first slide, which we are really talking about. And let me just, how do I make that big? Okay. So the 1959 general elections. There you have two images. You have an image on the left of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, with the white man on the right was the Governor General of the British government, and then the British government in Nigeria, so Governor General of Nigeria. And then you have Nnamdi Azikiwe on the right campaigning for the NCNC, and below you have a series of election results, and we're going to come to that and explain exactly what that means in a minute. All right, so let's get to it. So the 1959 general elections. So if you guys remember, in the last session, we talked very briefly about the elections, and I'd like to just elaborate on that a little bit. So during the elections, Awolowo approached Nnamdi Azikiwe about forming a coalition of their respective political parties in the South. Awolowo offered him the supreme title of prime minister. And then he said, okay, give me the role of Minister of Finance. Now, this would have been a befitting arrangement if you think about it, because of the work Zik had put in for more than 25 years at that point. It would have put Awolowo in a prime position to maybe even take over after him. So it would have worked out for both of them. Now, remember, Awolowo was the most, from the last session we discussed this, Awolowo was the most well-rounded of all the major figures, Bello, Azikiwe, and Awolowo. He was the most well-rounded one to run the parliamentary style government that Nigeria was to operate in independence. Now, keep in mind, in 1953, the northern leader, Ahmadu Bello, made a trip to Lagos. He went to discuss the possibility of early independence in 1956. Now, he wasn't ready. He wasn't ready. The North wasn't ready, and he said no. In his mind, he said, no, North is not ready. When he returned to Kano, the citizens criticized him so much. The man was so angry about this, and you know, because again, it's not right to criticize an emir in like Fulani Islamic culture. So this resulted in the Kano riots of 1953. Dozens of Southerners were killed during this period, senseless slaughter. So this set the tone for the program that would later come in 1966. We're going to come to that later. Perhaps with this in mind, Azikiwe, who despite being brilliant in many, many ways, lacked the necessary backbone to make the tough decisions in a place like Nigeria. Okay, and this comes back to haunt him. It doesn't. No, let me not say haunt him, but this is. In fact, I remember I was reading some of the comments from the last video. Son of Nok, I don't know if you see it. Son of Nok, are you around? Son of Nok referred to this issue about Azikiwe not being liked in the East for this particular reason. Thank you, people. Thank you, people. Okay, so I'm hearing the ones. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's get back to it. So, now, you see, look, let's talk about Zik for a minute. Nnamdi Azikiwe was a Garveyite. For those of you who don't know, he supported Marcus Garvey. He was around at the time that Marcus Garvey, around the time Marcus Garvey was being deported, but the UNIA was still a force. This is when he was in America. So his concern was seeing an independent Black nation. He wasn't as concerned in the other details because he saw what Marcus Garvey and the UNIA were proposing for Black people and by Black people. And maybe fearing what may happen had the South won the election vis-a-vis the Kano riots, Zik opted to go with the North rather than with Awolowo. And the British were well and truly happy with this arrangement. There's also some evidence to suggest, and we talked about this last week, that Azikiwe was also blackmailed by the British government. They threatened to indict him for some unpaid loans, if you remember, that he took from his own bank that he founded in 1956 whilst he was campaigning. He was taking loans to try and fund his campaign. They all did it, by the way. Awolowo did something like that similarly, but they use this on Zeke. And just as a side note, you see, Zeke, and I want to just stress this, Zeke Nnamdi Azikiwe could have gone down the route of a Lumumba. Remember, the situation in Congo at the time was kind of different in that there were, the educational level was very much lower than in Nigeria, but the characters were pretty much the same. If you look at it, Lumumba's party won the election in 1960, but the Belgians did everything in their power, absolutely everything in their power, to avoid him and his party, which was the MNC at the time, from taking office, if you remember. He then did a dodgy deal with Kasavubu. He became prime minister, Kasavubu became president. And it obviously backfired. But remember, the Belgians were protecting the Katanga province because of its wealth, its size, in the same way that the British wanted to control the North, who had access to the South, right? So they didn't want Zeke in power because of his ideals, but ultimately Zeke didn't carry himself like a Lumumba. Lumumba went to jail, was tortured, and so on. And he did everything he could. Lumumba did everything he could to get power or to get his country independent. Now, I'm not saying the two scenarios are exact. No two places are, but there were similarities. So back to Nigeria. I doubt the North would have seceded if Zeke and Awolowo joined up. So if they decided we're going to work together, I don't think the North would have seceded. The British wouldn't have allowed them. I don't even think they would have gone to war if Balewa lost that first election. They were backed heavily by Britain, who knew that the power in the wealth, the wealth of the South. He knew the power of the wealth in the South and wanted the North to control it. So again, going back to the Congo example, Shombe was like Balewa. And then Lumumba won the election, but Kasavubu became president. Kasavubu then appoints Lumumba as prime minister. But another way to kind of understand it would be what happened if you watch the news in Senegal, the election that we had earlier this year. So you had Ousmane Sonko, who was the main candidate. But Macky Sall said, Macky Sall was the serving president at the time. Macky Sall said no. He did everything to kick him out. Sonko then made a deal with Faye. So when Faye won the election, Faye then appointed Sonko as his VP. And, you only have to watch the news. It's basically like Sonko is the one that runs the government, pretty much. That's why this democracy thing is like a cancer to me. I think it's a cancer. Once you accept it, you begin to act like the people who perfected it, if you will. Anyway, so Zeke's NCNC party joined with the NPC. The deal on the table was for a ceremonial president role as head of state, with Ahmadu Bello's stooge, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, becoming Nigeria's first elected prime minister, who was the head of government. Now, Zeke took over briefly as the first, I think it was about a period of 6 months. He was the first Nigerian general governor, or head of state, if you will, after the British one stepped down, the man who I showed you in the previous slide. After independence in November 1960, basically the commander-in-chief and was the representative of the Queen in Nigeria. So one would assume that this was part of the agreement which Balewa and Bello thought would kind of dignify Zeke. After all, he supported them during the 1959 elections. But it was only for a short time. And at the oath of office, which, by the way, you can watch on YouTube, I think they made a short documentary about Zeke, where he really, really interesting, goes a little bit into his background, but it shows the days leading up to the oath of office and then the few days after. So he gave this very, very powerful speech, similar to the one, by the way, that Nkrumah made on Ghanaian, when the day Ghana became independent in 1957. I would have played it for you, but I think this whole YouTube thing, they make it very difficult. Once you play a clip, they just sanction you. But anyway, long story short, Obafemi Awolowo then stepped down as premier of Western Region in 1959 to run the election for prime minister, and he eventually became the leader of the opposition. So you could argue that this version of Nigeria was operating the closest. Sorry, you could argue that this version of Nigeria was operating the closest version of a federation that we've ever had. Remember, you had the 3 different regions. It became 4. Everyone was pretty much self-sustainable. Obviously, the West is where the capital was, so that's what created a little bit of a problem. You can only imagine if we had that same thing now. The 3 regions of the Federation, or 4 regions of the Federation, and then Abuja existed at that time. Now, obviously, Abuja would have been manipulated, but it would have got the ball rolling in a way that would have made sense. Okay. Anyway, everybody had its own assembly. It had its own army, and everything went through the premier and then later the governors of each region. And there's also enough evidence to show that the election was riddled with corruption. We talked about that in the last one, and there's a very good video that's floating around the internet about this man who worked in that government. So let's move on. So again, I will take your comments at the very, very end. So please stick around. Okay. So once again, 1960 to 1964, the problems of the First Republic. Those of you who are historians who are watching and who are historians, you know that the problems with that First Republic laid the foundation for the problems that we have today. Obviously, it doesn't start there, but that Nigeria as an independent nation didn't get off on the right foot. So Nigeria becomes independent in 1st of October 1960. There's a lot of jubilation and celebration. I'm fortunate enough to have parents who witnessed this as adults, and they all talk about how there was a euphoria. There was a burden of expectation on their country at the time. People who had gone abroad were coming home or beginning to come home during that First Republic. Nigeria was immediately expected to rally its many, many educated and brilliant minds, and let them start drafting policies towards development, start talking about the advancement of Africa, and take its lead. All this giant of Africa that we like to shout. We had the opportunity to really be that. We had more educated people than most other places in Africa. We didn't have the same economic problems that other places had. We had raw materials, we had personnel, huge population, and so on. Now, initially, as I said, there are 3 regions. You had 2 in the south, and 1 abnormally large one in the north. But the British, before independence, drafted this new plan. They were going to now divide the 2 regions in the south into 3. Okay, so it goes from 2 regions to 3 regions. We now have a region in the west, then what they call the Midwest, okay, and Eastern region, okay. I am going to quote from Emeka Ojukwu now, a man who we will introduce later. We'll introduce him properly later. So he said this. He said, the federation wasn't balanced from the outset. The North could dictate due to its size, and the Southeast or Southwest could only complain. The first few years of independence were okay, but they were unfulfilled ambitions of ordinary Nigerians. Very quickly, though, we started to see some very obvious cracks forming, which originated with the British. So what he's basically saying is there were many obvious signs in that First Republic of 1960 to 1964 and the beginning of the second one, of course. And I will be mentioning some of those major issues which haunt us today and which directly, make no mistake, directly influenced the coups of 1966 and the subsequent war. Okay, just so you can see that image one more time. So we go from 2 regions in the south to 3 regions. Now we have the Western, Midwestern region, and Eastern region. Okay, so 1960 to 1963. And then in that first republic, it gets bigger. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So I want to go through these reasons, and they're going to be three. How many reasons do I have? Three or four? Three reasons I have. One of them was the manipulation of the census, and the clip on the left is from a newspaper article, which is basically just making a mockery of this whole idea of votes and elections. But let's come to that. I will get to that. I think that's point 3. So manipulation of the northern census. So remember, last episode we discussed about the manipulation of the 1955 census, which basically made the North appear bigger than the South to give them, an advantage. This was orchestrated by the British to ensure that the North remained in power so that they can continue to, exploit the newly found oil, all located in the South, which was also far more educated, far more advanced than the North. And also, the South was vehemently opposed to British rule. So there was a need to make the North seem superior in population, and size, of course, justified this. So there's an article from the Nigerian Daily Express reported on the 3rd of March, 1964. 3rd of March, okay? This is referring to the census. It says, on attainment of independence in 1960, our first attempt to ascertain the population of Nigeria was the census exercise in 1962. So less than 2 years after independence, they attempted a census exercise. Listen to how they even word it. The then chairman of the Census Commission was J.J. Warren. The result of the census showed that northern Nigeria was 500,000 less in population than the South. So just to be clear, the population of the North was 500,000 less than the South. It makes sense. We talked about this last week. It makes sense. The North is more arid, more dry, going towards the Sahara, and the South is coastal. It's coastal. People migrate south. The capital is also in the South. So it makes sense, right? The Prime Minister, I'm continuing my quote here. The Prime Minister, Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, rejected the result, sacked Mr. Warren, and had him deported. The Prime Minister proceeded to order a recount in 1963. After due manipulation, the result of the census showed that the North was undercounted by 8.5 million. So the population, when it was done in 62, said the North was 500,000 less than the South. He sacks the person who does the vote, a Brit, and then the new count says in 1963 says that it was undercounted by 8.5 million. So he adds another 8 million on top of he adds another 8.5 million on top of the population. Which basically put the national population at 60.5 million. To round up the quote, the federal government under the Prime Minister scaled above the figure to 65.66 million. They scaled down the population of the North from 31 million to 29.8 million and allotted 28.8 million. So already, my people, you're seeing how the government headed by Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, or by proxy through Ahmadu Bello in the North, and by proxy the British, found a way to manipulate the population to make the North seem extravagantly bigger, even though when it was done accurately in 62, it showed that they were less than the South. Okay? Even the likes of Akintola, who was the Western Premier after Awolowo, and Okpara, who was in the East, protested this thing. But there was nothing they can do. So you tell me something. How can a nation begin to make sense of itself when we cannot even be honest about our population? It's why today nobody really believes our population. Whatever they call it now, one day is 190, 220. Around the world, they make population estimates about Nigeria, because if a country cannot even organize itself properly to count or accurately estimate how many people are there, so that, and it's not just so you know how many people are there, so that you can plan for them, so that you can allocate money, so that you know what you are doing. And don't forget, guys, if you remember the election of 2015, when Buhari versus Goodluck, APC versus PDP, the first real APC versus PDP, they struggled. If you remember, they said that something about, was it 20 or 30 million votes, adult votes, eligible voters? 20 or 30 in a country of two. And that's the first time people started complaining. They'll be like, how is this a country of 190 million when 20 or 30 million people? Yes, we know we have a youthful population, but are you saying to me, I used to be a maths teacher, that 20 million is an accurate representation of the 30% of the people? Haba. You know, it's just, it doesn't make sense. Now, even if you account for people who didn't vote or people who didn't register to vote, you cannot tell me that Nigeria is based off 20 million votes. It just doesn't make sense. So the story propagated by the British that they must maintain this lie of population because they feared the South would dominate the North. And so this was just the starting point, okay? Right, let's move on. So this next slide, reason number 2, Awolowo's incarceration. For those of you who have studied this topic, Awolowo's incarceration is key if you want to try and understand this thing. And for those of you who are just coming in, let me just remind you that today's topic is why the Biafra War happened, the coup of January 1966, okay? So Awolowo's incarceration is the second reason that, or the second major thing that went wrong in that First Republic. As you can see from the image, on the left, you have Samuel Akintola, who became premier of the West, sorry. On the far right, you see Nnamdi Azikiwe coming out of a Black Maria, a lorry, after being arrested. And then in the middle, you have the Nigerian Post announcing that Awolowo was charged for treason. Let me just explain to you the details of that. We talked about it last week as well, but let me just explain to you some of the key points. Where am I? Can you guys? You can't see me. Are you guys enjoying the view when I split it like this? Is that better? Is it better when I split it like this? Just give me a 1 if you like it the way it is. Okay. Yeah. Jimmy made a good point, by the way. 142 million at best. I think you mean at best. Yeah, I think so too. And even if it's not, even if it's greater, you cannot start messing around with Nigeria's population and think that you can just, we increase at an abnormal, this year is 190, next year is 220, the next year 270. Jesus, you people calm down. Just calm down with this population thing. And that's what we're doing as Nigerians. I did say I will read comments at the end, but let me just, last governor of Northern Nigeria, Sir Brian Sherwood Smith wrote, but as always, as friends, Northern Nigeria and the Cameroons, it says in details of British plans for Northern domination of Nigeria. Well, there you go. This is somebody who does his research. Okay, let me just deal with this incarceration of Awolowo. So again, remember Zeke turned down what you would have called a coalition deal presented by Awolowo. Awolowo ended up having no part to play in that First Republic. He was still a main figure in Nigeria, but he basically was only the leader of the opposition. So it was symbolic, but it had no real power outside of his party, the Action Group. He wasn't even the premier anymore of the Western region. Samuel Akintola was the premier, and he remained. Akintola remained as the number 2 in the Action Group, whilst Awolowo remained leader of the Action Group. But we could see again, Awolowo was someone that the British and the North saw as progressive, someone who should never, in their mind, never be in power, despite being the best man for the job. So in February 62, Awolowo's Action Group had their annual Congress in Jos, what is now called Plateau State. So Middle Belt, very beautiful. For those of you who haven't seen my film, short film, Tafia, it's a Hausa language film, which I shot in Jos. Beautiful. I think it's a beautiful film. The Action Group decided to suspend Akintola as the deputy leader for his insubordination. which we talked about. You see, Akintola was more of a ruthless politician like you see today. You know, these kind of politicians that will jump from one party to the other because they know it's all about maintaining their prestige and they want to hold on to power by any means necessary. So Akintola was like that. And he chose to go into alliance with the NPC, the Northern People's Congress, NPC party, which was run by Ahmadu Bello and Tafawa Balewa. And they were in stark contrast to Awolowo. Akintola's supporters, once he was removed, they were also removed. The secretary of the party and the governor of the Western region, who at the time was the Oni of Ife, that's the leader of the Egba people, if you want to call it that, in modern day Ogun State. No, not Ogun State, what am I saying? His name was, what's his name? Oba Adesoji, Aderemi. So he was also removed. So Premier of the Western region gone, Governor of the Western region, Secretary of the party, all removed for insubordination. They even removed Akintola. They removed they stopped him being part of the action group, but they stopped him being Western region Premier as well. So in order for them to do this, right, they needed to ratify it through the Western region's assembly. And they decided, okay, we're going to go into the assembly, we're going to vote and so on. On the day that the assembly was supposed to meet and discuss this, they sat in there. And can you believe? Lawmakers were fighting. They were throwing chairs, punching each other. Basically, all hell broke loose. So Balewa's government declared a state of emergency. And conveniently, he placed the then Minister of Health, a man by the name of Majeko Dumi, as the administrator of the Western region. So, just to be clear, they go in to ratify this thing. All hell breaks loose. Balewa then says, he declares a state of emergency and takes the Minister of Health, someone he can control, makes him administrator of the Western region. So Awolowo was basically frozen out. He was now displaced from the Western region. And the North, by proxy, was in control of the Western region. So they had the North, now they had the West. After that, Awolowo began to really back Akintola. And this is very, very important. Okay, it's a very important event in setting up the January 66 coup. In fact, I would say it's one of the catalysts, if not runner-up to the catalyst. Why? Because the officers in the army were all watching this. They watched all of this play out. You got to remember, the army at the time was the last place that was free of politics. Okay? There was some form of nepotism, no doubt, some form of tribalism, but generally speaking, it was based on merit. The chain of command in the army is gone now, by the way, but at the time, the chain of command was generally all that mattered. Men like Ironsi, who we'll talk about, Ojukwu, Nzogu, Obasanjo, Murtala Mohammed, the main actors of the coup, or the coups rather, of 66 and the Civil War, they were all watching this stuff happen. Most of them at this particular time, so 60 to 62, most of them were serving first in Cameroon and then in the Congo. I hate saying the Congo. In Congo, Congo Kinshasa, at the time, Congo Leopoldville. They were managing the crisis after Lumumba's, if you remember, Lumumba had house arrest first, then he escaped, then he was captured, and then the death. And then there was chaos. And if you remember, Katanga at the time, the very wealthy province of Katanga declared independence. So you had the Lumumbists, you had the Simbas, you had Mobutu, all fighting for some control. And then, like now, Nigerian troops stepped in as peacekeepers. Okay? So all this is happening. The army is watching this from afar. Back to the story. Now, in November of 62, so remember we had in February 62, we had the action group national convention, if you want to call it that. Now, in November of 62, Awolowo and 30 of his political associates were accused of plotting a coup against the federal government of Balewa. So they were basically charged with treasonable felony, which they like to charge everybody. For those of you, again, if you watch my documentary I made on Omoyele Sowore, they charged him with treasonable felony. I think Nnamdi Kanu, Sunday Igboho, all these people, they give them that same charge of treasonable felony. I think even Tinubu in the 80s, or is it 80s? Or the 90s, was charged with treasonable felony. In the 80s, excuse me. Okay, so they charged them with treasonable felony, some other charges, and basically they were sentenced to 10 years in prison. So once this happened, the government declared emergency in the West. No, once they were sentenced, the government under Balewa, of Balewa, declared that the state of emergency that was then in the West was now over. So with Akintola no longer a member of the action group, he formed a new party called the NNDP. And through his alliance with the NPC, the Northern People's Congress, he then bounced back as the premier of the Western region. So the action group votes him out. President puts a fake administrator. Awolowo is jailed. Akintola forms a new party, aligns himself with the NPC, and is back as the premier. Nigeria for you. So the Northern, the NPC, basically under Ahmadu Bello, and the new NNDP merged to form a new party, a coalition party, which they called the Nigerian National Alliance. So now we had a situation where the North was placing its own people in power in the West. They would eventually do this in the Midwest and East if the Southerners didn't react. So this created, excuse me, this created a lot of turmoil. Okay, it created a lot of turmoil in the area, and you know, it was so bad that Zeke, for once, and let me not say for once, Zeke Nnamdi Azikiwe, who is watching all this, he goes to him and Awolowo's supporters. Maybe you could say 3 years later than they should have. You know, because in 1959, they had the opportunity to come together. But 3 years later than they should have, Awolowo proposed to Zeke that let the NCNC, Zeke's party, merge with the Action Group and some other smaller groups to form a new party. They call this party the All Progressive Grand Alliance, UPGA. Okay? Don't confuse it with ABGA, which we have today. It's a different party. UPGA, UPGA. Too little, too late, I guess, because the man whose allegiance would have mattered, right? The man whose allegiance would have mattered, Awolowo, was already serving began serving his prison term in Calabar in the Eastern region. Okay, so we are looking at something we're looking at a problem that has been created, but this, and again, let me just summarize it for you guys. So the number two problem that was going on in that Second Republic was when Awolowo's incarceration happened. So the first was the census, the failed census, and then now we're moving on to number three. So vote rigging in the 1964 election. Again, you have an image there of the three main men, Bello, Zeke, and Awolowo. On the right, you have an article from the Daily Times. In fact, let me not even bring that up just yet. And then, in fact, let me go straight into this, because this is the final reason before we start getting into the meat of this whole thing. Okay, I hope you guys are enjoying this. Again, we'll take comments. Please stick around to the end so we can take comments. Okay, and we can have a discussion. Okay, so so vote rigging. Those 1964 elections are very important. Okay, remember I said the catalyst was for me the catalyst was the arrest of Awolowo, or close to the catalyst. But if it wasn't the catalyst, this vote rigging of the 1964 elections was a big one. So again, the first 4 years came to an end soon, pretty soon. It happened quickly. The various parties began to campaign for the 1964 elections. The second election was filled with so much corruption that even the BBC, who is part and parcel of the propaganda that we get from the North, they said that men had become pregnant with votes overnight. it was basically felt that the North used its power to ensure that their stooge, Akintola, won the election in the West. They used intimidation, thuggery, 60 years ago, thuggery, and the NNA won the majority of the seats in the parliament. Now, UPGA, which was Zeke and Action Group, the Action Group NCNC coalition, UPGA, said the North was using the federal government to rig the election, and they boycotted the election. Even the Electoral Commission at the time admitted that there were issues with, with the way the votes were cast, with the way the votes were made and the counting. But of course, they didn't really do anything about it. Elections didn't even really take place in the East. They didn't take place. In fact, by 21st of December 1964, more than 70 candidates of the NNA had returned to their seats unopposed. So they basically swept parliament. There was no election. Side note, by the way, who remembers the election a few years ago in Cameroon? If you remember, I think it was 2018 or 17, when Paul Biya 100% of the seats, or votes rather, of a region which openly opposed him. Remember that situation where some delegates went over to Buhari to talk to him about coming to support them, the English-speaking part of Cameroon, right? And then Buhari sent them back to be captured, basically sent them back to their death. Paul Biya 100% of the votes in that place. And we were doing this in Nigeria as far back as 64. So there was chaos in the Western region. And of course, when there's chaos in Nigeria, like many other places, when there's chaos, people start dying. Thousands were killed. There was even, at this time, there was even an acid phenomenon in the West. So the military was pulled in to stabilize things. Now, we have to, it seems like I'm not very complimentary about Nnamdi Azikiwe, but we have to give Zeke some credit for how he reacted to this whole thing. See, after the announcement of the 64 elections, after the general election results were announced, he refused to inaugurate the new parliament. Okay, that was his right as the head of state. He swore not to do it, and it would have really brought Nigeria to its knees. Okay, but in typical Azikiwe fashion, he chose to go down the route of peace. You call it peace, you could call it cowardice. It's really up to your perspective. I wasn't there, but from history, I'm looking at a pattern of behavior when it comes to him. He doesn't want trouble. He's that kind of person. But really, if you want change, you need to disrupt things, and that is seen as trouble to the people you're disrupting. So prominent Nigerians approached Zeke, came to him. He said, "Let's compromise so that we can, keep things going in this country." And you know what he agreed to, of course? He said, okay. He said, okay, no problem. Let's see. They made they said that we should form more of a broad-based government. And Zeke, please agree to this. Let's form a broad-based government, but let's exclude the action group, Awolowo's action group. Can you imagine? Nigeria is based off the NPC, NCNC, and the action group. The foundation of the independence struggle comes from those three parties. He said, let's remove them after 4 years. And of course, we're looking in hindsight. But the point of this series, again, is to be objective and analyze the things that went wrong in Nigeria's history. You see, the decisions which directly affect us today, these three reasons, Awolowo's arrest, the 62 census, and the rigging of the 64 election, they directly influenced what would happen in the January and July 1966 coups, which again directly influenced the declaration of Biafra, and of course the war from 67 to 1970. Okay, are we following, people? Please give me ones if you're here. There are few people in the chat. Please, first of all, hit the like button. Hit the like button and give me ones if you're following. Give me ones if you're following, please. Okay? So again, Zeke's actions, and I'm talking about Zeke's actions because they're very important. Okay? Now, we're going to move on now to a very important segment when we talk about what happened in those years. Okay, so we've gone from 60 to 64. Let's deal with the key actors. Okay, here you have an image to your left of Aguiyi-Ironsi and Emeka Ojukwu. I am going to just talk about these guys very, very briefly in a second. But I want to talk to you guys about the army. Okay, the army is very, very important if you want to understand this situation. Okay, the military actors are key. In fact, you know what? Let me talk about the army a bit later. Let's deal with 1966 to 1970. The military actors. Okay, before we move on from this stage, we must now introduce these guys because they will play key roles over the next few years. Yeah, from 64, really 66, they both step in up until 1970. One dies, but you know, I won't spoil it for you. And frankly, there are too many to mention. There are many military actors, but I want to just focus on these two because they're the most important. I want to focus on these two. So again, I'm talking about Aguiyi-Ironsi and Ojukwu. Let's deal with the first one now. Okay, Johnson Thomas. What did I write? Did I spell his name wrong? Umunnakwe Aguiyi-Ironsi. So let's deal with him first. Okay? Very handsome man. I'm joking. I don't mean it disrespectfully. So Ironsi is from Umuahia. That's in Abia State, one of the modern-day Abia states. And like many other Igbos and Easterners, he was partially raised in the north. So he spoke Hausa. He joined the army as an ordinary rank. He didn't go in as an officer. He joined in Kano in the north, where he lived. And, you know, during training, they saw it fit. They deemed it fit. The British deemed it fit for him to attend officer training in England, in a place called Camberley. Okay, not Sandhurst. You know, the Royal Military College Sandhurst. That's another one that's like higher. That's like the equivalent of West Point in America. And you're going to hear Sandhurst a few times today. Ironsi kept getting promoted under the British. And by the coup, the first coup of 66, January 66, he was the only major general in the Nigerian army. He even received a title from the Queen. Not that I rank them, but it just shows you how they saw him. He was a company man. He got an MBE from the Queen of England. Okay? Now they give those MBEs anyhow to athletes, to entertainers, everybody, they give you MBE. But at that time, they gave it to you for important acts. By independence, he was selected to lead the Nigerian contingent of the peacekeepers in the Congo. If you remember, we talked about the Congo a little bit earlier. So the Nigerian contingent, if you remember the situation, again, let me just go back a little bit. So that situation in Congo, you had the UN step in. So Lumumba was in crisis. He couldn't call the Russians because basically the Belgians had decided to side with the Katangas. And in order to keep peace, he was like, who am I going to call in? He was locked in a corner and he decided, okay, we'll call the UN. But the UN came and they were basically aiding the Belgians. In fact, the Belgians sent troops in and you had a mini war going on in Congo. So forced to, the Americans then make a play for Lumumba. And he's like, okay, no, I'm not going to go with this. And he brings the Russians in. And that was basically what sealed his fate. But the UN troops that come in there went there to support him. But the Nigerian troops, and there are quite a few different stories about this. We hear this thing all the time. Nigerian troops in Bosnia, Nigerian troops not in Bosnia, but African troops in general from across Africa working for the UN in even Senegal. Captain Mbaye, for example, who against the will of the UN was going and saving Tutsis, right? Hiding them and taking them to shelter. These are things that African troops in the UN had done over this last century. Whereas you look at what, anyway, let me not talk about that. Let's go back to what I was talking about. So Ironsi, by independence, was selected to lead the Nigerian contingent of the peacekeepers in Congo. Later, when the British commander left in 1965, they made Ironsi GOC. of the Nigerian army. That basically means general officer commanding, top dog. The first Nigerian to hold the title. Now, his second in command was a man called Brigadier Babafemi Olatunde Ogundipe, who was a veteran of the World War II campaign in Burma. For those of you who are curious to know what the campaign in Burma was about, go and watch David Lean's film, Bridge on the River Kwai, which basically talks about prisoners of war, British POWs in Burma. So Ironsi was a serious man, okay? And so were the men around him. He got all his promotions under the British officers, unlike some of the later generals that we had and we have. And he was not a desk general, okay, which is something that a man called Major Theophilus Danjuma said about him, okay? So this is a serious man we're dealing with. Let's move on to the next guy. Emeka Ojukwu, okay? And I'm going to keep this on. I'm not going to show myself just yet because there are some, the people in the picture I really want you to understand, okay? So he was the son of Louis Odumegwu Ojukwu, who is on the right side, a multi-millionaire. In fact, some people say he was the first billionaire. I don't know how, I think in modern day, in the modern day equivalent, he would be a billionaire. But he was a multi-millionaire at the time. He was knighted by the British monarchy as well. He made his fortune across Nigeria, and despite being from Nnewi, which is today's Anambra State as well, he was detribalized to the point where he could raise his family across northern Nigeria and western Nigeria. In fact, excuse me, Louis, actually, you know what? There's a way I can show you myself at the same time. Can you see me? Yeah, you can see me. Okay, so I'll keep that there just for now. So he was detribalized, okay? In fact, excuse me. Now, why I've left this on there is because you see there's an image there of his father with Azikwe, if you look carefully. He contributed, he was a financial contributor to the NCNC parties in its early days, the Herbert Macaulay, after the Herbert Macaulay period. So now his son, Chukwuemeka, usually that's a name that, if you know, in Igbo-speaking people, they tend to give that name to the first son, okay? In Anambra, it's very common. My older brother is also Chukwuemeka. Now, his upbringing, Chukwuemeka's upbringing, was similar to Zik in that he was raised in the north and the south. He was what we call a Wazobia, which is someone who speaks the three dominant languages, not the, because we have far more languages than that, but the three largely populated languages, Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa, Wazobia. Ojukwu went to CMS Grammar School, which we talked about last week. We talked about the establishment of CMS Grammar School in the last session. He went to King's College, Lagos, when it was still King's College. You know, those of you who know KC now, is not what it used to be. Then he went to Epsom College in the UK, and then eventually attended Oxford and received a master's degree in English. So very eloquent speaker. I advise you go to YouTube, just see how the man spoke, the kind of things he thought. His thought process was very calculated, but also very calm. And I advise you, where is it? What did I do with it? I advise you, I left it in the other room. I advise all of you to read the book Emeka by Frederick Forsyth. Okay, Frederick Forsyth is the guy who wrote The Day of the Jackal, by the way. I advise you guys to read that book. Okay, it's a very short read. I don't know if you can find it on Amazon for a cheaper price, but if not, check on eBay, sorry. But written by Frederick Forsyth, who at the time was working as a correspondent for was it the BBC? I can't remember, ITN or the BBC. During the Biafra War, he sat down and wrote a biography about Emeka. Very interesting book. Now, when Emeka returned from the UK, against his father's wishes, he joined the army. Okay? He basically was running away from his father's shadow. When you have a father who's a billionaire, with all due respect, there are some billionaires' children today who you're asking yourself, what do these people do for a living in Nigeria? I don't want to name names, but you know who I'm talking about. You're just like, what do they do? What are you doing? Your father has all these billions. Go and use that leverage to make something of yourself out of their shadow. But they just going to events and you know, it's a sad situation. But Emeka obviously had the will to say, I want to get away from my father's shadow. And not just his father's shadow, his father had pull in the army. He was trying to get him into get him in as an officer. And he was like, no, I don't want to do it your way. I'm going to make it on my own. Okay. Joins in as a cadet in the North. He eventually attended the military academy at Sandhurst, the Royal Military College, became an officer. And after independence, served in some of the campaigns, the first campaign in Cameroon. And today, when you talk about Ojukwu, he is even regarded as the paramount leader of all Igbo land, mainly because of his actions between 67 and 70, or should I say 66 and 70. He is the central figure, not the reason for Biafra. He's the central figure for Biafra. He's not the reason for it, the central figure. Now, the other actors, I will talk about as we go along. I don't want to spend all day on this. And incidentally, you know what? Let me move on. Let me move on. I don't want to waste too much time. I keep digressing. Okay, are we all here? Are we all here? Okay. Now, reasons for the January the January coup of 1966, January 15th coup. Let me just put this up. For those of you, I'm live on TikTok. I'm trying to figure out this whole TikTok thing. So if you don't know, just check out on TikTok. We're there as well. Reasons for the January 66 coup. Okay, these reasons I am going to go into now, and then we will round up once we complete talking about the January 66 coup. So basically, we've reached essentially what a series of things that you can call as the main catalyst for the Civil War. All those things that were happening were the catalyst for the military's intervention. Now we're talking about the catalyst for the Civil War. So if we look at it objectively from the events 59, 1962, and then the 64 elections, you can easily see that the January 66 coup was staged to prevent a Northern People's Congress running all of Nigeria. So remember, the North has sided with the West. Akintola has formed a party with the Northern Party. And gradually we're getting to a point where the NPC was going to control all of Nigeria. And the coup-plotters could see this. This is a statement that the coup-plotters made just after the coup, which was validated by a British colonial officer by the name of Trevor Clark. It was also validated by a man named Major General MC Ali, who, by the way, served under Abacha in the 90s as well. Okay. Now, remember, I said the army had been watching everything that was going on. The chaos, the nepotism, the corruption, the way the civil service was being run. And they were also watching the coups that were going on across Africa at this time. Okay, we've obviously seen the situation with Lumumba. Mobutu eventually steps in and runs the country. But they also saw the situation with Olympio in Togo. You remember the situation with Olympio? Sylvanus Olympio in Togo. There was the coup, he was murdered, and then Eyadema, Nasimbe Eyadema steps in, and basically Eyadema's son is still in power. So we're talking of 60, when was that, 63, I think? 63 or 64, that Olympio was killed, 63. Eyadema led till 2005, and then his son is still in power. So we see this legacy going on even today. So it's well known that the NPC government had been secretly planning its own coup. And a procedure, if you will, not a coup, sorry, but a procedure which they called Operation No Mercy. They were planning it for around the same January time. It was designed to remove all opposition at this point to the Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Think about that. They've got control of the West by proxy. East is not complying. And not just that, in the West, you still have the Action Group members. In the East, you have the NCNC members. They've now come together. There are quite a few people who can stir up a hornet's nest. So they were planning something called Operation No Mercy that will wipe them out. It was run by the Sardana of Sokoto, Mr. Bello or Sir Bello, and it was to be led by a man by the name of a man from the north, a major called Zachary Mai Malari. Why was it supposed to be led by this man called Zachary Mai Malari? Well, let's give you a little bit of backstory. This was a man who had already refused to take orders from Ironsi whilst they were serving in the Congo. He was a subordinate of, he was below Ironsi in rank. Ironsi was his commanding officer, and he refused to take orders from him. Was seen as insubordinate. So Ironsi at the time, again, if you remember, he was commandant of the UN peacekeepers, the Nigerian peacekeepers for the UN. And Ironsi really could have sanctioned him. He could have dealt with him, court-martialed him maybe. Instead, again, Ironsi, he chose not to sanction him. He instead decided to send him back to Nigeria. So you can imagine if the Sardana's coup the Operation No Mercy had been successful, Zachary Mai Malari would not have spared the life of Ironsi. Especially given what happened in the counter-coup of July 1966. This proves my point. So January 1915, the coup, the January 15 coup has the most misconceptions, I think. And I want to try and deal with them, okay? More than the July 66 coup. The July 66 coup had some misconceptions as well. But I want you to remember that the geopolitics of Nigeria, the British involvement and the support of the North, and also the state of affairs after independence. A coup would make sense. So let's look at some of the misconceptions. The important question now is, did the North think a coup was coming? Did Northern Nigeria think or expect a coup to be coming from the South or from the larger country, if you will? Surely the Sardana and his lackeys in Lagos should have known. So let's move on and let's start dealing with the meat and potatoes of this. Why did the East dominate the army? Hang on. Reasons for January 66. Oh, my bad. I think have I missed a slide somewhere? Did the North know a coup was coming? Okay. I think I've missed a slide somewhere, guys. 1 second. Oh, no, I've missed a slide. Oh, Lord. Okay. All right. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just talk through it. Aish, I missed the slide somewhere, guys. Pardon me. Okay. So let's deal with did they know a coup was coming? So Laduke Akintola, so Premier of Samuel Akintola, if you want to call him that, or Premier of the Western region, he had been reinstated as Premier of the West by Balewa. And if you read the book, In the Eyes of History, Samuel Laduke Akintola, or Laduke Samuel Akintola, forget the name, I referenced it at the beginning. What it says is, a day before the January 15th coup, Akintola visited the Sardana in Kaduna. He went to visit Ahmadu Bello. And based on this book, both men had been told that military action was a possibility, given the state of Nigeria at the time, given the state of the country. Now, apparently, Ahmadu Bello said something to the effect of some like waxing lyrical statement. If the Almighty Allah didn't call him to die, then no bullets would strike me. You know? No, you know how these people are. Oh, if God doesn't want me to die that day, I will not die. Of course, yes. But, you know, I think I don't know whether this is what he truly felt, but history shows that perhaps he didn't believe a coup could happen because of what he and his people were planning. It's almost like in his mind, it's like, you wait and see what we're all planning before you talk about coup. I think that's more what he was trying to say. And Ironsi even visited Balewa. Okay, Balewa, just before this, was on a break in Bauchi, in northern Nigeria, and warned him of the possibility. But him too, Balewa too, did not heed his advice. And what resulted was, a bloody coup, a bloody, well and truly murderous, violent, bloody coup. There's no death that isn't violent. And people make a lot of. Anyway, let me not say anything about death, but it was a bloody coup, no problem. The Premier of the Western region, Mr. Akintola, Premier of the Northern region, Ahmadu Bello, Premier of the Midwest, Festus Okotie-Eboh, and Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. They were all killed. Some of them even with their wives. I think Balewa was with his wife. Horrible that they were murdered in such a way. And it sent shockwaves through the country, especially because of who they spared, or who didn't die, or who was unsuccessful, who the coup plotters were unsuccessful in killing. Okay, the Premier of the Eastern region was still alive. There's a good reason for it. At the time, the Archbishop of Cyprus, a guy named Macarius, was visiting. Okay, Cyprus had its own coups and stuff, its own problems going on at the time, but the Archbishop was visiting. You don't go and, so can you imagine the international disaster if they had tried to go and kill the Premier of the Eastern region whilst this man is right there? Can you imagine? Politically, internationally, what kind of shockwaves that would have been that would have sent? There was a situation in Rwanda, if you remember. Again, I keep going back to Rwanda. I don't know why. Why do we always keep going back there? Burundi and Rwanda. The president of Habyarimana in Rwanda in '94 was on the plane with the president of Burundi when it was shot down till they both died. And you see the chaos that came from there. Imagine you try and kill Archbishop Macarius in Eastern Nigeria, or you try and kill his host. Anyway, they spared the they spared the GOC of the army, Mr. Ironsi. Actually, no, let me not say that. The GOC of the army was Aguiyi-Ironsi. I'll come to him in a minute why he wasn't killed. Nnamdi Azikiwe had left in '65, the October of 1965. Remember, this is January. He went to the UK on some sort of medical leave. He returned later after the coup. I think he returned around February. But he was, typically not available to be killed. Coincidence? I don't know. So this and one other point is why the coup was incorrectly labeled an Igbo coup. I repeat again and again, from the evidence, if you're being objective, not if you're being superficial, it was not an Igbo coup. And I'll discuss this more in, I think, 2 chapters to go. I will discuss it. I also gave you guys reasons why some of these actors were spared, but I didn't mention why Ironsi was killed. And I will, was not killed, rather. And I will talk about that in a minute. So let's move on to the next slide. Again, give me a 1 if you're following. Give me if you have any questions. We'll deal with them at the end, okay? So why... Okay, I missed more than 1 slide. This is really disappointing. Do you know, I've been planning these slides for weeks. Anyway, I did say I was going to talk about the army, okay? And its importance. But I think it's very important to understand the reason why there are so many Igbos. There are so many Igbos in the army, especially in the officer corps. Okay, and I want to go through some of the reasons as to why that is. Okay, there was there was a perceived dominance of Eastern officers in the Nigerian army, because it's very easy to say when we start talking about the coup plotters that they are all Igbo, or in theory most of them are Igbo, which is not really true. You have Ironsi, is an Igbo man, is the head of the government. You have high-ranking Igbo men throughout the sorry, not the government, of the army, and you have high-ranking Igbo people throughout the army. And I think those people who go and unfairly label this an Igbo coup don't know that the Eastern officers dominated the Nigerian army, not because they were necessarily better, but it has to do with these three reasons that I've put up on the screen. Now, since the coup was led by members of the Nigerian military, let's look at the situation in the military before this time. And before I say this as well, I want to make one point, guys. You see, if it is true that Nigerian nationalism was directly influenced by the political leaders who had, you know, what you would say is a shared desire to nationalize against the British, then it is also true that the horrors that we have in Nigeria today, in our politics, are directly impacted by the officers who joined the Nigerian army in and around independence in 1960, not before. Obasanjo, Buhari, Gowon. Okay, Obasanjo joined earlier. Gowon, Babangida. All of these guys were young officers at the time. They are still walking the earth today, taking turns to become president. They are directly responsible. That second set, if you will, second generation, is directly responsible for the horrors that we have today. So let's deal with the makeup of the Nigerian army before independence. Now, one of the participants of the coup of January 66 was a man named Captain Ben Boulier. He passed away recently, I think like 2022, I think, or 21. But he joined the army in 1960. He was an Igbo man from the eastern Nigeria. He was selected for officer training at Sandhurst, then served at Chatham House. Sorry, just served at Chatham, and eventually the USA before returning in 1965 during the chaos of the that was caused after the 64 elections, when Zeke, by the way, ran away. Now, he wrote quite a few books about the coup and what happened after the coup. But one of them that you should read, I referenced it at the beginning, is called Nigeria's Five Majors. He was basically referring to the so-called five majors involved in the January coup, which is also a myth. He was actually making fun of the fact that the British had said there were five majors. It was something like 7 or 8, not to mention the captains and a couple of colonels. Right? But it's easy. You know, British people like headlines. They said 5 majors. But anyway, he called it the 5 majors. Right? Now, according to Captain Ben Boulier, he said that at the time he joined the army, 60% of the Nigerian officer corps were Igbos. Personally, in my opinion, I think he meant, today, the proper word would probably be they were Easterners. Because again, someone like Nzogu is always referred to as an Igbo person. Now, for those of you who are into the whole, what's the word? They are more in line with the Biafra way of thinking. We'll just group anybody who answers an Igbo name, which is fine. But I think to respect the people's culture a little bit more, Igbos should be people who are more in line with Igbo culture and not just answer Igbo names, because Igbo is the dominant group in a particular part of that eastern Nigeria. Okay, so I think he meant Easterners dominated the army. Okay, so somebody like Nzogu, for example, he will answer an Igbo name, but he's part of he's part of one of the small nationalities, Idoma, Ijaw, all those different groups. Okay, and that's why I think the partitioning of Africa, to me, I think is something I feel that will take centuries for us to recover from, because we were lumped together with people we didn't choose to be with. So it's unfair. And now all of a sudden we have situations like this where somebody from this place is regarded as part of this thing. Now they may be cousins, but they are not part of the same immediate family. Now, according to a book, and I'm taking too long here, according to a book entitled Ironsi, Nigeria, the Army and Power, by January 1966, Nigeria had 40 majors in its army, and 24 were Igbo. 24 were Igbo people. The rarest were from what is now the South Nigeria. They went up to 5 who achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel. So basically, lieutenant colonel is when you start getting a sort of control of a brigade or a platoon, not platoon. You start getting a small barracks. Maybe you control a barracks. Major, you become maybe your training or your head of the armory, those type of things. And then you've got basically officer corps starts at lieutenant and above. So 20. So he's not even talking about officers. He's talking about majors. 24 of them out of 40, 24 were Igbo. Anyway, why did Easterners dominate the officer corps under the British Army? Number one is education. Many of them joined the army at the end of the World War II, right? Which was basically in the late 1940s. People like Ironsi joined, I think, earlier, just before the end of World War II. People like Ojukwu joined in the 50s. People like Ben Boulier, like I said, he joined in 1960s, so in the 60s. And at the time, you needed a school certificate to join the army. Remember the last session when we were discussing the state of education in the North at the time that Lugard had left it under, Lord Lugard, and how far behind the South was. By the time the North first had a school, there were already several in the South. So you mostly saw Southerners as NCOs and as officers. When Buhari was, if you remember 2015, when he won the first election, do you remember people were complaining about him never producing his school certificate? Do you remember that? That he didn't provide his school certificate. Okay, so that speaks to this point that I'm making, that people in the North, because of the education wasn't as widespread as the South, they went in as cadets, not as officer cadets, but privates. The second reason now is there were no quotas at the time. There were no quotas in the officer corps. The other reason is that, now, in fact, let me make this point. Remember, the British were peddling this whole one Nigeria thing, which is why Southerners dominated around the country in pretty much every field, including the officer corps of the army, right? So there was no quota. The last reason, and I want to speed up here because I don't want to, this is taking a lot longer than I expected. The power of the Sadana, Ahmadu Bello. You see, in every sane nation, the army is an appendage of the executive political party in power. And at the time, political authority rested with the prime minister, who was Balewa, but he was a puppet of the premier of northern Nigeria, who was Ahmadu Bello, a Fulani man. So the army was effectively controlled by the Sadana of Sokoto, which was part and parcel of the British plan for northern dominance in the first place. So to summarize, the officer corps may have been dominated by Southerners, but the sergeant and the lower ranks were mainly from, you would call it the middle belt and the north. Okay, generally they group the middle belt as part of the north. With this in mind, if the army corps was upset with the way the government was being run and planning a coup, it's highly likely that a good number of them would have been Easterners. And it would have been certainly most likely that they would have been from the South, taking part from the South. The people, because of the sheer number of Southerners and specifically Igbo people or Easterners. So it wouldn't have been Northerners that would, even though there would have been some that were disgruntled with the situation, it's highly unlikely based on the numbers that they would have taken part in that first coup. This is why we need to stop this statement about the January 15 being an Igbo coup. It's too simplistic. So let me actually ask you guys the question. Let's ask the question and actually try and deal with the question. Was it an Igbo coup? Was the January 1966 coup an Igbo coup? Okay, let's deal with that. First things first, I don't want anyone to think that I condone violence. Actually, let me not say that. Or that I condone the violent ways that people were killed during that coup or any other coup for that matter. I'm sympathetic to the loss of life. Don't get it twisted. On all sides through this period and every period since then that we've had coups and wars and battles and so on. But this is a question of historical fact. You see, my generation, our generation isn't taught, we weren't taught history in school, which is why we open our mouths today and we blame everyone else for our problems. We must, and we need to understand the political background before we really start to understand how to move forward, because we will be the leaders over the next, my generation. If you're late 30s, early 40s, you're part of my generation. In the next 10, 20 years, you're going to be the one running the country. Our generation is going to be running the country. How can we do better for our children if we don't understand history? This is the problem that you see with these guys now. All these idiots that weren't taught history, they took over in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. Then their children took over in the 2000s. And you can see the madness going on. All right? Now, if you want to find the root of any problem, Amos Wilson quotes, look and see who stands to benefit the most from it. In this case, let's look at the who's. The who's involved in this coup overall. People that died, people that were involved, etc. Okay? Let's look at them in more detail. So, let's start with who was involved. So here you have an image, some images of 3 key members. You have Major Ademoyega, Major Nzogu, Major Ifajuna, and then on the right, you have a list of other people, right? Again, Nzogu is really labeled as the leader of this coup a lot. And this is why I think research, and you don't have to do that much research, just pick up a book. You will pick up some of the books that I was talking about, and you'll find out that this thing was far more multi-layered than we think. On the right there, you have people like Colonel Wobosi, Major Nwatuegu, Major Okafor, Major Chukwuka, Major Onufro, Captain Boulier, who I've already mentioned, who's the author of about 3 or 4 books on the subject. Okay, let's deal with this now. In fact, you know what? Because I need to be on screen, and this needs to be on screen so that you can understand it a bit more. Okay, so who was involved? Now, anyone who studies the January, actually, you know what? Let me put it back because I'm uncomfortable with this small image in case I want to clip it. Now, anyone who studies the January 15 coup will see that there were 2 principal actors, right? One of them, that's if you study, or not if you just ask somebody. If you study, there were 2 principal actors. One was a Westerner, Major Adewale Ademoyega, who was a graduate of history. Okay, graduate of history, and I put it there, from the University of London. Along with Major Emmanuel Ifajuna, who was a graduate of sciences from University of Ibadan. They were the ideological basis of the coup. Whereas Nzogu, Major Nzogu, and others were more like the backbone. Nzogu was more like, okay, let's get it done. Okay, so this moment, let's get it done. He's that kind of guy. Side note, Nigeria should remember also that Ifajuna and Nzogu had incredible athletic achievements for what would have then been part of Britain, but Nigeria, they were athletes. I think Ifajuna did, is it high jump? I can't remember. Won a Commonwealth gold medal. And Nzogu was just an all-rounder. You know? So let's not forget them for that. We don't even talk about them when we talk about our athletics. But then again, we don't celebrate our athletes. So that's another story. Again, they talk about the so-called 5 majors in the coup, but there were really about 7 or 8 in total who were involved in the planning. Now, apart from those 3 that I mentioned, we had Timothy Nwatuegu, Chris Onufuro, Don Okafor, Humphrey Chukwuka, and then you also had Captain Ben Boulier and Colonel Wobosi. All of them were Easterners, with the exception of Ademoyega. They were not all Igbos, though. But for those who want to stay on the superficial, it's okay. I'll give you that one. Now, beneath them, there were also lieutenants from the other groups in Nigeria. Some from the north as well, in the lower groups that got involved, in the lower ranks, sorry. But how could it be an Igbo coup if only 4 or 5 out of the majors that were involved were Igbo? Remember the statistic that we had earlier. Out of 40 majors in the Nigerian army at the time, 24 were Igbos. How is this an Igbo coup if only 4 of them took part? But again, I can see how many will still say, okay, it's not good enough. So let me move on to the next slide. Let's see if I can prove it even further with my next slide. Let's look at who was killed. Let's look at who was killed. And let me remove this caption at the bottom so that you don't miss out on anything. So here we have an image of 4 different people. Okay. I want you to remember their names because I'm going to switch over back to myself now. Okay, so look at those names very, very carefully. Let me go through each of them. So we know the civilians who were killed. We talked about some of them. We know that most of them were Northerners. Fine. We know some of them were from the West, and we know they were from the Midwest. But the reality is they controlled the corrupt government at the time that everybody wanted to replace. And it was set for them to rule with impunity. That is what they were preparing. They were already ruling with impunity, and they were setting over to take over the country completely. But when you look at the army personnel that died during this January 66 coup, it will throw some doubts. You see, it was very different when the military officers were actually, let me do it this way. Let's go through the names. Let me just bring the image back for you again. Let's go through these names so that we can just have a better understanding. Okay. So, and I'm going to start from Brigadier Ademulegun, excuse me. So he was the commander of the 1st Brigade in Kaduna. He was murdered at nighttime in bed along with his wife. Horrible, brutal. In fact, his daughter, Sholakwe, she wrote a book about her parents, I think, recently. In fact, I saw an interview with her a few days ago. Shout out to Edmond Obilo as well. He does a lot of good work on this subject, very good resources, and has access to a lot of these books. So Edmond Obilo on YouTube is another guy you should check out. You had Brigadier Zachary Mai Malari, who we've already talked about. He was commander of the 2nd Brigade in Apapa. Then you had Colonel Ralph Shodeinde, who was commander of the Military Training College. And then we had Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Chinyelu Unegbe, who was Quartermaster General of the Nigerian Army. Okay, Quartermaster General is the one responsible for the supplies, uniforms, weapons. He has to account for everything. It's basically like a form of a bookkeeper for the army. Now, Unegbe's story is interesting. He was approached by the Coup-Plotters to be part of it. He said no. And so they killed him for opposing it. Which shows you, I guess, the unity, or if you want, lack of unity, I don't know how you want to call it, but the unity, because it's something that's interesting as well. Yakubu Gowon, by the way, was Unegbe's best man at his wedding. But the army was so impartial, at least from the Igbos, from the eastern side, to this kind of, oh, you're my kinsman, let's carry on. And I think it had a long-lasting effect on our country. But anyway, let me move on. From this list, you will see that not one of them is Fulani. Isn't that interesting? Not one of these people is a Fulani or a Northerner, if you want to. Well, they're Northerners, but none of them is a Fulani. Even this Brigadier Mai Malari, based on this, the way they've described what the North is, yes, he was a Northerner, but he wasn't Hausa or Fulani. And this speaks to the confusion that's created by the scramble for Africa. Because somebody can go and draw an arbitrary line and say, okay, all of this is Northern, right? And you group hundreds of different ethnic groups together and say, okay, you're all part of the same people. And just going back to Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who we talked about at the beginning of the last session, Our southern brothers, especially Igbos, still don't seem to understand how propaganda works. Even despite Azikwe being a what they call the darling of Nigerian journalism. I saw this last week at my father's funeral as well, actually. You see, in the East, we can be so petty and emotional. And we don't get the importance of keeping things in-house, solving things in-house, projecting a better global image. You see, because especially in a federation, everyone tries to make their side look good. Okay? Nigeria is not the best example of it. But if you look during the colonial era, the North, they established something called the Northern Historical Society. And I know this. I went to do a documentary in Kano. Watch my documentary, by the way, on the channel. My documentary in Kano about the Hausa Bakwai. The Northern Historical Society even got British writers like Moffat to come and spread all sorts of untruths about their history. Misinformation, basically. But it is why the North is still considered as a bloc. Even though the Kanuris might not like the Fulanis, the TVs or Tivs might not like Jukun, even though now they're technically classed as Middle Belt. But they were all grouped as Northerners. So the coup, at all stages, wasn't Igbo dominated. But the Northern leadership made it seem this way because they understand propaganda. Next slide. Okay. I just realized the last one, I didn't even show my face. So who stood to benefit? And right there, you have Obafemi Awolowo. This is self-explanatory. For anyone who has done any research on this subject, who stood to benefit the most? Without a shadow of a doubt, it was Obafemi Awolowo. Why? Because the biggest reason why the January 15th coup happened, or the biggest reason rather why the January 15th coup could not be an Igbo coup, is because the aim of the coup-plotters was to place this man, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, in as prime minister. That was their agenda. It was confirmed by Awolowo in his book, A March Towards Prison. So please don't take my word for it. It was also confirmed by Major Nzogu in an interview he did just after the coup, or the coup failed. And it was confirmed by Captain Ben Boulier, one of the coup plotters, in his book, The Five Majors. Just even looking at the personnel in key positions at the time, were it to be an Igbo coup, it would have been, it would have been easy as, it would have been a walkover. Were it to be an Igbo coup. If it was about Igbo dominance, oh my God, it would have been a walkover. All the commands in Lagos, from battalion command, the armory, quartermaster general, they were Igbos. Even in the north, Ojukwu was in the north, commanding a battalion. Now, let's look at who crushed the coup. Who stopped the coup? Because the coup wasn't a success. Let's remember that. We talk about this coup. Yes, it killed a lot of key personnel in the north. It removed the leadership of the country, but it wasn't a success. So let's deal with who crushed the coup. And there I showed you an image. In fact, let me go back. Sorry. Let me just quickly explain. There you have an image of a young Ojukwu and Ironsi. Okay. So let's deal with this. We act, the 15th of January was not a success. Okay, so let's stop acting like it was. And if you look at why it wasn't a success, it's down to whether you want to call them Igbos or Easterners. But really, if you're talking about the Igbo coup myth, it's Igbos that actually stopped this coup. Particularly Ojukwu, like I said, in the north, and Ironsi in Lagos. You see, Ojukwu was serving as the commander of the 5th Battalion in Kano, just as Nzogu was executing the coup in Kaduna. Now, if you read Emeka, which was the book written by Frederick Forsyth, which is the biography about Emeka Ojukwu, Ojukwu refused to cooperate when some people, when there were soldiers that were sent by Nzogu to him in Kano. He refused to cooperate with them. And ultimately that made the coup a failure in the north. Even though Nzogu had control of Kaduna. In fact, Nzogu even threatened to, he said he threatened to march south to deal with Ojukwu. But Ojukwu held firm. He's like, no, this doesn't make sense. It's not right. And a side note, by the way, Ojukwu was Igbo speaking, but Nzogu was of the Anyoma people. Okay? They're Easterners, but they're two different people. Anyoma people are in Delta. Ojukwu is from Anambra. Yes, there's a river that separates them, but they're not exactly the same. Their names sound like Igbo, but that's due to the Igbo influence on the area. But they are different people, and I want to start respecting these different people. So Nzogus and Anyoma people. Now, if you want to look at the greater Igbo family, of course, yes, you could say they are part of the same family. Whether you call them Igbo or not is a matter of history. And this is something which I want to do. I want to do a documentary on this. But anyway, for me, I look at the Anyoma Igbo thing as more like, and the example that I use is, if you know Germany, by the way, Germany, you have Bavarians, and then you have the rest of Germany, right? Or a different part of Germany. Bavarians, are slightly different to the Germany has its own tribes, if you will. Bavarians are different to other people. But if somebody was to say, yes, let's divide, let's make Germany and create it as part of Western Europe, you would just call all of those Germans, okay? And you would base it on superficial similarities, which is what they do with Anyoma, Idoma people, and Igbos. They just group them together, So the answer to the question, was it an Igbo coup? Have we done enough to understand that it was not an Igbo coup? Okay? And, what have I done here? Was it an Igbo coup? The answer is no. A big fat no. It was not an Igbo coup. And we cannot even say this enough. Now, the elephant in the room, I guess you could say, and we're coming up to the very last slide before we move on, before we wrap up for today. Why was it that Ironsi was not killed? Why was he spared on the coup day? You see, this is a very important question. It is what feeds into this BS argument that it was an Igbo coup. Ojukwu and Ironsi, without question, are the two people that foiled it. Without question. Ademulegun was one of the, he's a southerner, but he's not Igbo. Nzogu is not Igbo, but let's just say you want to group him as Igbo. They were executing a plan that was supposed to take out not just politicians, but also army personnel. They killed some army personnel. We mentioned all but one of the ones that I mentioned, and they killed a few more northerners. Excuse me, I didn't mention them, but I was trying to make a point. They killed a few more northern army officers who were in control, but they killed a lot of southerners, including Igbo ones. But why is it that Ironsi? Why was Ironsi not killed? Okay, let's deal with that now. Well, again, there's so much information on the role of Ironsi during the coup. Mostly this happens because he's Igbo. Ultimately, you could say he ended up benefiting the most in the end by becoming president. So if indeed Ironsi was a target, why didn't the Coup-Plotters get to Ironsi? Well, the Coup-Plotters actually sent one, a man called Lieutenant Oji, Ogbonaya Oji. He died actually quite recently, I think like 2 years ago. They sent him to arrest General Ironsi. And there's a book written by Major Philip Effiong, which I bought at Nnamdi Azikiwe Airport once. Really good book. Philip Effiong, if you remember, would later become vice president of Biafra. He would become Ojukwu's number 2. He was a man of, you see, Akwa Ibom or Cross River. So basically a Calabar-ish, Calabar-speaking man. So basically, when Lieutenant Oji went to Ironsi, Ironsi was driving his car, actually coming out of a function. Okay, remember, this is in the early hours of the morning. And they met on the road. You see, Ironsi had already heard of the coup through his intelligence, general officer commanding. And he left his house, driving his Jag. He was driving a Jaguar with an armed guard as well, which was basically, they give you an armed guard if you're a general. Now, remember also, Ironsi was the only major general at the time, so people respected his authority. And in those days especially, people respected your rank. I don't know how it is now. I have a good friend who is a former corporal in the Nigerian army, and the way he talks about the army, he served in Sambisa Forest, he served in Sudan. The way he talks about army superiors, I don't know. Just things are not the same anyway. But anyway, people respected authority in those days. So when he when Ironsi met Oji on the road, he told this man off, cussed him out for taking part of the coup, and basically overpowered him. Now, had Nzogu been the one that had gone to meet Ironsi, it would have been a very, very different scenario, because Nzogu was ruthless. Nzogu, they called him, I think it was a nickname. He's also called Kaduna. Where did he go? The same place that he had lived, Kaduna. Who is he responsible for killing? The Sadana. Ruthless man. If he was the one that met Ironsi, he would have got the job done. Remember, Nzogu as well was trained at Sandhurst. He was the first officer trained in military intelligence from Nigeria. First officer. The man was a phenomenal athlete, like Zeke as well. Zeke was a boxer, he was a footballer, American footballer as well. And anyway, but back to Nzogu. And I say this about Nzogu. Look, he had a fascinating story. For a man who didn't only live till about 30 or 31, whatever. If we're serious people, if he's another one who we need to at least consider making a film about, or telling his story in more detail, because there's not that much information about him. Yes, he brutally killed people, but he was an idealist. What about the subsequent coups in Nigeria that they were just killing people for the sake of it? They were not idealists. They were just doing it so they could Emilokon, so that it can be their turn. Okay, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, but let me get back to my point. Anyways, Ironsi benefited the most from the January coup after he rounded up all the coup plotters and arrested them. Now, Gowon, who a lot of people, by the way, assume was Ironsi's army chief of staff during the coup, he had only arrived in Nigeria not long before the coup, and he had no command. He couldn't even move troops around. But he always likes to make out like he stopped the coup. The truth is, Ironsi actually sent a Cameroonian man by the name of Captain Hans Anago, Anagho. Go and look this man up. I think he's still alive. In fact, he's a traditional ruler in Cameroon. He sent him to help quell the coup in the southwest. Remember, English Cameroon at the time was part of Nigeria in the run-up to independence. In fact, part of Adamawa state was in Cameroon, right? And again, this is a situation that happened pretty much because when Germany lost in World War II, France and Britain took over, or France took over Germany's part of northern Cameroon and southern Cameroon as well. Okay, so France and England, they shared it. So at independence, the North decided to join what would be Nigeria, joined part of what would now be called Adamawa State, and the South decided to join. They voted to join France. To join Cameroon, the French-speaking part, which is interesting. You look at the situation, it happened like that in Togo as well. They held a referendum in Togo, which was Togoland was part of Ghana. They said, okay, at independence, which one do you want to join? Do you want to be part of Ghana or do you want to be an independent nation? They said, we'll be independent. So this happened. This is why I say Scramble for Africa it was going to take us centuries to figure out. And so you see how silly this experiment is. You see, our problem in Africa is not each other. It is the demon implanted in us. Anyway, much later, back to Captain Anago. he was sent to quell the coup, and then much later he rejoined Cameroon. He joined Cameroon, became an army officer in Cameroon, and became a general actually, but he was a captain at the time. So the British lied that Gowon crushed the coup. It's part of their propaganda. Gowon actually just volunteered to join them as they were continuing to go and round up the coup-plotters, but he wasn't actually stopping anything. But the man who today is 90 plus, I don't know how old he is, 90 years old, he's still going around claiming to be a hero of that 66 coup, the January 66 coup. And those who know Lagos, just logistics, those who know Lagos, it was Ironsi who went from his home in Ikoyi to the cantonment on the mainland, to wake up a man by the name of Colonel Ojukwu, another Igbo answering an Igbo name, an Igbo man, Colonel Ojukwu. He woke him up in the middle of the night to gather his soldiers and delegate them to crush the coup. So you see, at all levels, Easterners were involved in stopping this coup. And that's how Ironsi survived the coup. He didn't survive it because he was lucky. The person that they sent to arrest him, he met them there after hearing about the coup going on around the country, used some expertise to speak to the guy. He did have a small guard with him. And then this guy managed to fall for it. Then he gets Captain Anago, goes to Colonel Ojukwu, and together they go and stop the rest of the coup plotters around the country. Keeping in mind, Balewa is based in Lagos. I think they found his body just on the outskirts of Lagos. So everything is happening in Lagos. I mean, with the exception of the Bello and Ikotiebo. But everything's happening in Lagos. And Ibadan, not too far with Akintola. So had Ojukwu resisted, joined Nzogu in the north, and you would have had Ojukwu and Nzogu controlling the northern armies, and in the south you'd have had Ironsi at a stalemate, which is what we ended up, which we ended up having something different, because eventually Nzogu was arrested and brought down to Lagos. So that's how Ironsi survived the coup. Okay. That's how Ironsi survived the coup. And for now, this is where we're going to stop, because what I don't want to do is spend too much. This is a very broad topic, and the second coup and how that leads into the Biafra War, the so-called Biafra War, the Civil War, how that leads into the Civil War is a separate issue. We are talking about building blocks. We talked about what happened, how Nigeria was formed. Now we talked about the problems of that first republic, how the issues created the first coup. Then we'll talk about how that first coup, this is on the next session, we'll talk about how that first coup led to the second coup and ultimately to the Biafra War. So this is what I want to discuss at another day. So let me round up, okay? So this is basically the end of this part, and I'll be back probably next week, Friday or Saturday, to discuss the reasons of the July 66 coup and any other events which have led up to, and some of the other events which have led up to the Civil War of 66. So let me use this time to read some of your comments. Okay, where are we? So let's go back to the top. Again, my brother, thank you so much for the super chat. Thank you so much. Very, very much appreciated. This is not something which most people just use their Saturday nights to do. But this is something I'm very passionate about. Passionate about history, I'm passionate about our country. I really believe when Nigeria gets it right, when Congo, DRC gets it right, the rest of the black world will become so proud. You won't have to worry about who you're from. Sorry, where you're from. You won't have to worry about that. You will have a sense of pride within yourself. So thank you. This means a lot, my brother. Okay, let's. Okay, so sorry for the loss of your. Thank you. I'll keep you in my prayers. I sent you an email about a month ago. There's a book I recommend, The Fatherless People. Okay, no problem. I'll check it out. I'll have a look at the emails. I haven't had a chance to. Last go. Oh yeah, I think I read this one already. Okay, Nigeria's population is no more than about 157 million. A lot of people talked about. In fact, if you know LD, the rapper LD from Tribesmen, if you remember, founding member of Tribesmen, there's a podcast I watched recently where he was talking about he doesn't believe it, and it's funny. I never thought about the fact that I didn't believe it. I just, just always like, oh, it's Niger, But when you really start to analyze it, you start to look at, especially when you travel, you start to see the densely populated South. Even Lagos's population, they say 20 million. I don't know if it is. I don't even think it's that much. But anyway, let's keep moving. Harold Smith. Britain worked in colonial Nigeria, confirmed the rigging of the first election. Yes, there's a very good video you can find which is circulating around the internet. He was serving in the 1950s along with his wife, I believe. And they talk about how they set this thing up from the beginning to as an advantage for the North. But we have to read the books that our people have also written if we're going to understand. Jimmy, madness. The huge population is an avenue to embezzle money, and it is still going on. Absolutely. That's my point. That is my point. They will talk about the, and if you even see how they divide the states, I talked about this last week. You have something like, 17 southern states, 19 in the north. Why? Again, I traveled from Abuja to Kaduna, to Kano. And anyone who does that journey, you'll see that as you're driving through Kano, yes, Kano is very populated, densely populated, I guess. Kaduna is kind of densely populated, but the area around it, especially when you go to the northeast of Nigeria, you're just like, where are all the people? But anyway, Britain was highly skilled and finding and propping up corrupt individuals like Festus Okotie-Eboh, Mr. 10%, Akintola and Balewa to further their agenda. Absolutely. This was all about Britain remaining in control of their former colony. And this is why you have to credit the Brits, who are cunning. They entered the transatlantic slave trade. They turned it into a business. At that time, Portuguese were in it. Dutch were in it. Norwegians were kind of in it. Everyone was doing it on a small level. They entered it and brought in stock market. They started speculating on human beings. They started saying, okay, we envisage this much. Let's start insuring these ships. They come to the colonial era. You see them using troops during First World War, Second World War. The Second World War is this rise of nationalism. Everywhere around the world, they're trying to gain independence. You see what they even did in Palestine. I'm going to leave you guys to sort out the problem that we created, and then you see what happens. I'm going to go to India. I'm going to allow you guys on the eve of independence to split up and become Pakistan and India, create chaos. I'm going to come to Africa and, okay, you know what? I'm going to give you indirect rule in the north, kind of in the south. And you know what? When you're independent, I'm going to put you guys together and you can sort yourself out. But I want the north to be in control. So they were subtle with everything. That's why you have to give them props. The Belgians, if you remember when they were leaving, when they decided reluctantly to leave power, they were like, first of all, we won't allow you guys to have an independent country. The political party that won the election, we're not going to allow you guys to have it. And then on top of that, we're going to side with whoever believes in our policies. Portugal held on to power too long. Portuguese held on to Angola, Mozambique, till the 70s, till the mid-70s. So all the Belgians in Rwanda, you see what they did, and Burundi. But the British were slick, because without a shadow of a doubt, even today, you can argue that they still control Nigeria, along with America. Okay, YouTube has been showing you on my feed. Had to manually search you up, brother. Thank you. YouTube, that's really interesting. They like me again with the algorithm. I went off it for like over a year. So anyway, Festus Okotie-Eboh was Minister of Finance. Dennis Chukwude Osadebe was the Premier of the Midwestern region. Did I get the names wrong? Minister of Finance. Who labeled who labeled Igbo coup? Oh, Igbo coup. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Who labeled the Igbo coup? By the way, let me just point out to you guys. I'm a little bit tired. It's 2:30 in the morning. I started this quite late, so I spent the whole day with my children at an event, and I started this quite late. So it's possible that I might have said things. I watched the last one back as well. I said some stuff that was incoherent at times. I'm tired. Sorry if I got anything wrong. Who labeled it an Igbo coup? A lot of people talk about this being an Igbo coup. But again, superficial comments. Lizzie, my sister, I would say because the North is Islamic influence and social structure. Yes, we talked about that last week. Discussions around the coup and the war till this day is very contentious. And you see, this is the thing. And this is why I think I said it towards the end. I said, look, we have to recognize that the problem is not each other. The problem is we know it's the British, but it's the British state frame of mind that is inside our heads. This imaginary white man that is in our heads, who makes us think anything that is ours is inferior, who makes us think that we are inferior to each other. Because again, if you watch my documentary, The Dahomey Kingdom, towards the end, as I'm going towards the coast, there's something I said in the voiceover, which is, it is not until we get on the ships that we realize that our blackness brought us together. So you can be from Dahomey or you can be from Oyo. And when you get on the ships, it doesn't matter if you guys have been at war for a decade. When you find yourself lying down next to this member of the opposite army or your enemy, and you're both puking and vomiting together, and the white man is flogging you, when you come up on deck, you realize, oh boy, if we don't band together, we will not get out of this alive. So you decide, okay, I see you. Now let's kill him. That's how these uprisings in Haiti, in Virginia, all these parts of America, is from people from different parts of Africa coming together. And I think this is the problem. So I actually don't think we are the problem. I think it's the imaginary Igbo person in our head that's been implanted in our head. If you control the way a man thinks, you don't have to worry about his actions. So when we realize that, that's the key to victory. That's why I came into this thing and I've been putting off talking about it because I know how my own people are, Igbo-speaking people. I know how Nigerians are in general. But I said, let's come and look at this thing objectively. You know, which is why I went back to Christianity and the formation of Christianity in Nigeria. All right. Education was prevented in the North and instead promoted Islamic education. Yes. Festus, I don't know if you watched our last series, the last session. That was exactly what we were talking about. It was looked at, and even to today, you see the Almajiri culture in Nigeria is in the North, you know? All right. Okay. Britain returned Anglo-Cameroon to Cameroon to reduce the potential votes of the NCNC. The referendum of Anglo-Cameroon to leave Nigeria was a farce. Plan was for a bigger North and a weaker South. Good point. Very good point. Very, very, very insightful. Herbert Macaulay and early educated Yorubas protested British rule. Lugard and the British colonizers hated the educated Yoruba. Education and civil service jobs were given to Igbos. Very good. Oh, wow. Another super chat. Thank you so much. Your channel is a gem, truly Pan-African and historical analysis. I have you up there with, wow, Robin Walker. Wow. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Festus, we need to talk. I'll probably get you on we can talk about something, maybe the final session we can do. Hence, you saw a disproportionate number of Igbo civil servants and soldiers. Policy was to prevent Yorubas from attaining any power. Thank you, my sister. It's funny, I was trying to remember. I said Belgians, Portuguese, the French too have their own. Thank you. But we've dealt with the French on this channel, as you know. We've talked about them at length because of what was the live that we did where we talked about French a lot. I can't remember now. It's maybe a few years ago, where we talked about the breakdown of the franc CFA, the West African franc, the CEDEAO, the ECOWAS region, and how that's controlled by France. How the plan for the French, former French colonies was less so about becoming independent, but more about being part of French society, you know? So these are things which, yes, you're right. French have their own way. Okay. I watched the last series. British policy was to keep the North completely ignorant, aka Boko Haram. Absolutely. Okay, that's excellent. My people, I want to thank you. It's 2:36. This has been a very interactive session. I hope I made sense. I'm gonna try and do the next one a little bit earlier. Because frankly, this one I nearly fell asleep and then I remembered I had to do it because I was supposed to be on yesterday. But anyway, my people, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I really, really appreciate this live. Thank you for the super chats. Again, let's continue to do this. I'm gonna try and oops. What's this music? I'm gonna try and do this as often as I can now. I'm really trying to focus on this a bit more. So before you leave, let me just advise all of you: hit the like button on your way out. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Those again, I've been talking for how many years? You people, I need to get you people on. Okay, I need to get you people on. Lizzie, some of you regulars, you don't want to come on. I want to see you people. Let's discuss this thing as a group. It's not only me that will talk. So please, everybody, hit me up. AEA Films on what do you call it again? TikTok, on Instagram. What's the other one? Yeah, just those two that we have. Oh yeah, and X. So hit us up. Hit me up. On the channel, there's a way you can direct message me or email me. Festus, you said you emailed me. I'm gonna look for it. I don't know if you emailed me directly, but maybe emailed the YouTube account for the AEA Films. So I'm gonna hit you up, and then we'll find a way to do this together. Anyway, again, thank you. Again, thank you for your prayers. My father is buried now. I thank the Creator. It went smoothly. And, I hope that we'll be back. Lizzie, you are smiling. Stop, oh. Lizzie. Anyway, we'll come back to that another time. Anyway, my people, let me go to bed. Thank you so much for your time. Blessings to you, and we'll speak again next